Most of you probably already know that as humans, our closest living relatives are the members of the genus Pan, or the chimpanzees. Both warlike and hypersexual, these animals share 98.8% of our DNA, more than any other animal. They are our closest living relative, our cousins, and interestingly enough, we are also theirs. Genus Pan shares more genetically with modern humans than they do with any other ape, including gorillas and orangutans. A common misconception is that we evolved from chimpanzees. The reality is that they are simply our cousins, and we both hail from a common ancestor. 7 million years ago, there were no humans and there were no chimpanzees, at least not like we know them today. But the ancestor of us both was clambering through the ancient jungles. One hypothesis suggests that this ancestor was Sahelanthropus chadensis, and it is generally thought that geologic activity split a population in two over time. The first population kept their dense tropical forest habitat abundant in trees and resources, while the other population, over millions of years, saw their home become the East African Rift Valley, a comparatively arid savanna. With the loss of heavy forest trees, the members of the second population, our ancestors, were forced to the ground. There were, of course, other factors that facilitated our bipedality, and our ancient ape relatives clung to a semi-arboreal lifestyle for as long as they could. But a life in the trees was not in the cards for these primates. Instead, they would descend from the branches and out onto the vast African plains. From there, natural pressures selected for bipedality, better thermoregulation, and larger brains, and eventually, through much trial and error, our first true human ancestors strolled their way out of Africa to become the dominant species on the planet. We gained the anatomical prerequisites to use tools and rise to prominence, and through that, we lost other traits. Comparatively, the ancestors of modern chimpanzees, both the common chimp and the bonobo, were faced with less environmental pressure, and while they are certainly not the same animal as Sahelanthropus chadensis, they are still considerably less divergent from our common ancestor in comparison to humans. So what if the natural pressures had been slightly different? What if we gained the benefit of larger brains and upright walking, but kept some of the more basal hominoid traits? How would that impact our society at large? That is what we're going to explore today. Now, understand that losing some of these traits was vital for others to prevail and land us where we are today. So this is purely hypothetical, and we're probably going to have to use our imaginations a little bit. So number 1, coarse hair. One of the most outright obvious differences between modern humans and the genus Pan is that they are covered in thick, coarse hair while we have a much finer, less obvious coat. We actually have the same number of hair follicles. It's simply the state of the individual hairs that varies. So why did our hair thin out? The primary reason is to allow us to sweat. As one of the most efficient thermoregulators in the entire animal kingdom, we owe a lot to our sweat glands, which cooled us off in the ancient African savanna. Some have suggested that losing that thick coat of hair in favor of a thinner one was one of the most important steps in our evolution, as heavy sweating allowed us to eventually pick up persistence hunting, and it is thought that meat acquisition allowed our brains to develop at a faster rate. Others have suggested that it was in part due to sexual selection, and less hair simply became a preference. Maybe it was because it was easier to assess the general health of a potential mate, search for parasites, and the like. Either way, let's imagine for a moment that the natural pressures that impacted our evolution selected for intelligence and bipedality, but for some strange reason left our body hair untouched. How would hairier humans impact our modern society? The biggest influence would likely be on clothing. Fitting tight garments around a thick coat of hair would be incredibly inefficient and time-consuming, so we would likely see the persistence of light and flowy clothes into the modern era if clothing use ever developed at all. Shaving in humans has been done for centuries, but it's much easier when your hair is thin. Ancient Egyptians, for instance, would use pumice to mechanically rub off the fine coat, but if we had kept our thick coats, shaving likely would not have developed, at least not in the ancient world. The proper tools to shave an entire hairy human, and to keep them shaved, would probably be too time-consuming when there were crops to grow. And finally, given the classic human tribalism, unique forms of prejudice would likely have emerged based off of body hair color, thickness, and length. Number 2, large canines. Losing huge canines was likely a consequence of three factors working in tandem. At least that's what the current consensus is. The first is the reduction of sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism is a term used to describe differences in the males and the females of a species. In peacocks, for instance, males have those beautiful and ornate feathers, and the females are somewhat drab. In some primates, we see a disparity in size and in canine tooth length, where the males have the bigger guns. Females of primates have large canines as well, but the primary use of these dagger-like teeth is for male-male competition. In primate species where males compete for limited female access, they are generally much larger than the females, and the social structure is usually harem-based, also known as polygyny. This means that a single male has access to multiple females and he blocks all others from copulation. This is seen in gorillas and baboons most clearly. Compare this to the chimpanzees and bonobos, where the canines are smaller in both males and females, but more equal to one another in size. This is because these guys are far more promiscuous, in that both sexes mate with many suitors. On the far other end of the spectrum are the monogamous gibbons, where the males and females are nearly indistinguishable from one another in size and in canine tooth length. Once a male woos a female, they're together for life, and as such, there's little reason for sexual dimorphism, as competition is restrained to the window of initial mate acquisition. So we see that the trend is that as social structure strays from polygyny, or one male, many females, sexual dimorphism tends to decrease. If sexual dimorphism decreases, then so does male-male competition, for the most part. And without male-male competition, there ceases to be a reason for overtly huge canines. Strict polygyny also seems to be bad for overall social cohesion among large groups of primates, as it can lead to intense stress among the males. So given the social systems of our closest relatives strayed towards more of a free-love polygamy, meaning both sexes are mating with many of the opposite, it serves to reason that our hominid ancestors did as well, and that as the male-male competition lessened, the canine size had no reason to stay audacious among the males. As social bonds continued to strengthen, our ancestors also began to experience a selection for larger brain cases to house larger brains. This further reduced the size of all teeth in the jaw, but particularly the canines. And finally, tool use cemented the loss of large canines. Who needs this when you've got this? So the lessening dimorphism equalized canine size in both sexes, and then a growing brain case and the acquisition of tools shrunk them further. But what if those pressures for reduction were mitigated in some other way? Well, I imagine that if we had large canines today, males, females, or both would have a social preference for larger fangs, similar to how we see a preference for a larger size in primary and secondary sex characteristics today. So as within the wild, large canines could be sought after in either sex. Dude. Nice. Oh my god, Chad's canines are so hot. Not like that virgin gamer. We would likely see a sexualization of canine teeth to some degree, and the orthodontics industry would be booming thanks to a demand for canine enhancement surgeries. Large canines would certainly create a new layer to the picture of how various cultures view attraction, and leaders with larger canines would perhaps be favored over those with, smaller ones. It's also possible that our diets may have continued to favor the consumption of certain leaf species, so instead of fast food burger joints, we may have Leaf King. Number 3, sexual swelling. This is a big one for the females. This is a sexual response some female primates have due to the varying hormone levels across their menstrual cycles. It is a means for females to essentially advertise fertility to resident males, and while it is more extreme in Old World monkeys, our closest living relatives experience it to a degree as well. It is likely that at some point along the line our ancestors experienced this sexual phenomena, but lost it along the way to concealed ovulation, which is a much less embarrassing alternative. Concealed ovulation is fascinating, but is complicated and intense, and is thus a topic for another time. But let's say that females kept this overt advertisement strategy. It begins to occur early in many primates, when they are sexually maturing, aka going through puberty. So if we had retained this trait, this sort of socially embarrassing biological mechanic would be occurring in preteen girls. Imagine for a moment the horror of an 8th grader going through first estrus. She's about to start the spring's first track meet, and she's really excited because she's the best hurdler in 7th grade, and the 200-meter hurdle is starting in like 20 minutes, and then, boom, first estrus. She panics, she talks to her friends, she's like, hey, does anybody have any estrus pads? I just started estrus, and everybody's like, oh no, I don't have one, so she has to call her parents. But her mom's out of town, so her dad has to go buy the estrus pads and then bring them to the track meet, and both parties are mortified because it's a daughter and a father, and they don't want to talk about it, and so she goes and she quickly applies the estrus pad, and, then the race starts, and she's so worried that the whole crowd is going to notice that she's on estrus, and I don't know, do they? Do they notice? Unless this event were socially acceptable and thus exempt from ridicule, which hasn't typically been the case for, say, menstruation, the cultural implications both in the past and in the present would be wildly different for young girls.
What do you mean, every month? Honey, that's the glory of being a woman.
Perhaps we would see a greater separation between adolescent children based on primary sex characteristics. But imagine the cruelty children would inflict on the more socially outcast kids going through their first estrus. It would be a massacre. So nothing at all like today. If we are considering an alternate reality where estrus is treated like menstruation, we would likely see a lot of products dedicated to reducing or hiding estrus swellings, as well as reducing their inconvenience, similar to pads and tampons. But there is an alternative, where this adolescent stepping stone is deemed a reason for celebration in youth and desirability in adulthood. Of course, there are some disturbing implications with this reality given how early humans would experience sexual swelling in their lifetime. Because creeps exist in every reality, and sexual maturity does not, under any circumstance, indicate a capability to consent. Number 4. Breasts. There was a lot of opportunity for a clickbaity thumbnail on this one. So this is another one for the females. Humans stand alone as the only primates with permanently enlarged breasts. In all others, the breasts are only enlarged when pregnant or nursing, and they are flat-chested at all other times. There isn't really a solidly accepted hypothesis for why human females all have permanently enlarged breasts. Some think it was part of a broader sexual selection, that females with larger breasts were simply better at attracting mates. Males benefited from this hominin selection process too, as females seemed to select for a larger phallus size across the cultural board in comparison to all other primates. Humans. The sexy ape. So what if that selection never occurred and female humans had flat chests outside of pregnancy and nursing? Well, female sexualization would likely take a new form entirely, as breasts would be limited to reproduction, a decidedly unsexy event. It's likely that we just see sexualization occur around other parts of the female human body, like the rear, as if we don't see that today. This drastic change in focus would be seen across all art as well, and the female form would be decidedly less curvy and appear more pear or banana-shaped across the board. Perhaps sexualization in media would be non-existent, given the stimulus to select for and potentially objectify women with big breasts would have never evolved in the first place. Maybe the hypersexualization of females would have never occurred, but it probably would have. Additionally, lingerie would be interesting. And what about the topless female in public laws? Would those only apply when she was nursing and the breasts were enlarged? One can only wonder. Number 5, opposable toes. This one is the least likely, but the most interesting, which is why it's at the end. I say least likely because the loss of the divergent, opposable, big toe in our ancestors is actually what facilitated our bipedality, or walking upright. Our acquisition of meat would have been a lot tougher without the ability to persistent hunt, which is how we did it naturally because of our means to hyper-efficiently move on our 2 feet. So our brains probably would have developed slower, since it's currently thought that adding meat to the diet is what kind of sped that process up. But again, we're being creative, and we're assuming that we reach modern society, or at least our agricultural phase, with opposable toes. Anatomically, we would be completely different. Unlike others on this list, our feet and movement style were not a sort of response to other large-scale evolutionary change. They were the large-scale evolutionary change. Without bipedality, we would not have had the need to lose our heavy coats. We would still need to move quadrupedally, mostly at least, and so our knuckles would remain lockable and robust. If we had never developed bipedality, we're looking at an entirely different version of ourselves, an ape which would have very likely never had the need to develop tools or language and may have simply adapted to the savanna like other terrestrial primates. It's actually incredible how much of our modern world is built around how we move, and how a seemingly small change would completely restructure it. But I mean, come on, it's still kind of fun to imagine. First and foremost, as terrestrial and occasionally bipedal primates, we would have likely seen society expand much slower, as any long-term movement would have to be on 4 legs. Tree towns along those initial expansion routes aren't hard to imagine, especially given our 4-legged stance would disadvantage our range of sight, and a high-up dwelling place may mitigate some of that. If we reach the advent of modern technology with this anatomy, infrastructure would be overhauled compared to our current reality. We are bipeds with the ability to move long distances efficiently and without much effort. These cities would be built around as little bipedal movement as possible, perhaps favoring public transportation and vegetation being incorporated into the buildings. Technology like cars would be outfitted for a greater range of motion as well. All in all, our evolution has been a pretty interesting path, and we pretty well know why we are the way that we are, why we walk on 2 feet, why we have big brains, why our teeth look the way they do. But that doesn't mean that it isn't fun to imagine a world that may have been a little bit stranger.